everyone, it's Den here, and today I have Eric with me. Eric, please introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, and my name's Eric. I work at Link. I've been studying Japanese for about a year and a half, and it's great to be here and talk to you, Denny. I watched your videos early on when I started learning Japanese, and I think today's going to be quite an interesting discussion where we talk about our methods and we talk about other methods out there, and I hope we can help your audience and those who are thinking about learning Japanese.
Yeah, so the main topic of our conversation is going to be the immersion method of learning languages. And that has various movements. There's the AJAT method, there's the mass immersion approach. But the whole overarching idea is basically the same, that you want to, as they say, immerse yourself in the language and spend as much time as possible learning the language, reading, listening, just being surrounded by the language that you're learning. For me personally, it's basically the same thing as what I always called just practicing. As Eric said before we started recording, is that it kind of overcomplicates things a little bit with language learning.
In some sense, I think immersion can mean a lot of things, and I think sometimes people just try to do too much at once. And that might be a little bit complicated, I guess, for people trying to learn a new language. Just don't think too much about the rules and whatnot, especially when it comes to immersion. Sometimes I feel that these methods out there and this whole approach to immersion can be a little bit tricky for some people.
Yeah. So let's talk about the pros of this method, which is like the main benefit is, of course, that it is actually a very effective method. We've certainly seen many people who have attempted to learn with AJAT for Japanese or the mass immersion approach. And we are in the Japanese learning community, but I'm sure that there must be very similar methods in other languages and other language learning communities. But yeah, this definitely does yield results. But really, the main benefit or the main kind of point is that you're supposed to spend a lot of time immersing in the language, learning, reading, all that stuff, which is kind of more important than the method itself, really, if you think about it.
Exactly. Everyone has their own goal, right? So whether or not you want to speak, you want to read, you want to write, as long as you spend the time doing something you enjoy and working towards your goals, you're going to achieve that. Now, with the immersion method, my take on it is you're kind of working on everything at once. You're listening, you might be speaking, you might be writing. You're kind of doing things you would do in your normal everyday life in your target language. So I think that's actually quite useful for some people. Some other people, that might be a little bit overwhelming. For me, in my case, for example, I'm not interested in writing by hand Japanese. So my immersion or my studying does not involve that aspect. My goal is to speak, read, and listen. But yeah, as you said before, the positive of immersion and the overarching theme of it is spending as much time as you can learning the language, spending as much time in your target language. And there's no doubt about it, the more you do that, the more you're going to learn and the faster you're going to progress. One of the keys to language learning, as Steve Kaufman always says, is time. The more time you spend with the language, the better you'll become.
Yeah, which if you're an experienced language learner, it might be kind of obvious. Some people think that, like some unexperienced people, I guess, think that you have to study it academically to properly learn it. And they don't realize that it's not really about that. It's about the actual time using the language in a real world situation, right? So listening, reading, stuff like that. And the immersion method certainly excels at that. And another big point is that it helps with language acquisition, which the way I understand it is that it is, as opposed to just understanding what you're hearing, you have an intuitive feeling of what it means, right? You're not thinking about, oh, this means that in my native language. You are just understanding it in the language itself, right? So you have a more intuitive knowledge. So yeah, that is certainly one of the biggest benefits of the immersion method. However, there are some negatives. And the main con really is that you really just have to put in a lot of time. I think I heard from some people who are doing immersion that the quota is to do 40 hours of active immersion per week. And that is certainly, if you have a job and you have relationships and friendships and, you know, you have other things in your life, that is a lot of time to spend just on language learning, right?
Exactly. Being in the Japanese language learning community, we have things that are coming out, other groups, other methods. We got AJAT, we got MIA, and those are actually based, from what I understand, around immersion. The fundamental thing about those methods is that you immerse yourself in Japanese. Now, when you were talking about the cons, the time requirement, while it's necessary to put in the time, you might have a job, you might have things to do, and those methods that I just mentioned, especially AJAX, it does say that you need to spend this much time all day, pretty much doing Japanese, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And while that could help, I mean, I'm sure it's effective, it's not realistic for a lot of people, I think. And immersing yourself is, in my opinion, it can be quite uncomfortable. So you need to be, one of the big things about languages is you need to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And if you're going to start immersing yourself right away, it might be a bit tricky and you just might not know what the heck is going on. So going back to your point about the time spent, maybe it's actually better to spend less time in the beginning and gradually work your way up so you get used to the language. I don't know, in my case, when I started learning Japanese, if I was just watching dramas for 5, 6 hours a day, I feel like I would get nothing done. It would just be going in one ear, out the other ear. Maybe a couple episodes.
And can get burned out.
Exactly. So that could be a con for some people when they look at these approaches and the amount of time required being stated could be a bit demotivating, as you said.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm actually curious. Please do write in the comments if that has happened. But I have never heard of anyone having started off learning a language with the immersion method, unless they've already learned a language with the immersion method before, right? But if you're talking about your first experience with the immersion method, I feel like the vast majority of people out there, they would already be at some decent-ish level by the time they start MIA or AJAT or whatever it is. So if you actually were a complete beginner and you've never had experience with the immersion method and you're starting off learning the language with the immersion method, it's just, I feel like the biggest issue would be burnout. You would maybe do it for a week to a month and just get completely burned out because, like, if you think about 40 hours a week, that is almost 6 hours a day, which is insane. If you have university, if you have work, right, that's just insane. Yeah, I just feel like if you have the time, sure, go for it. And like, you will get results. We're not arguing with that at all. But for the vast majority of people out there, this is just not going to work. Or it will work temporarily and then they will just get burned out and quit. And I believe I have seen, I know that I have seen a few people out there. I haven't seen that many people who learn MIA. But I think most of the people that I've met have complained about being stressed about not fulfilling their quota or, just feeling like guilt or like frustration or stuff like that, right? So that is probably the biggest con of it, is that because of the time investment you have to make, it can just really be demotivating.
Yeah, and we can talk about how to overcome that. You could just forget about the time thing. Don't worry about tracking your time. I know some people like to do that. And then also just, as I say, go with the flow. That's the advice I have for those who are struggling with reaching their time goals and whatnot. Everyone has stuff to do. Moving on from the time aspect, I want to also talk about the opportunity cost. something I think about when learning Japanese is the opportunity cost. I could be doing X, but instead I'm doing Japanese. That's one of the reasons why I don't spend all day, 4, 5, 6 hours learning Japanese. In my opinion, there's a bit of an opportunity cost. I want to grow my career. I want to do things outside of learning a language. And so I simply just don't spend the optimal amount of time learning Japanese every day. I do study every day, but I don't spend countless hours. I mean, I work full time. And you know what? As someone who's been doing it for a year and a half, I'm pleased with the results. I can speak to my friends. Mind you, I make tons of mistakes, but I can read. I read NHK articles, easy news here and there, but I'm still able to make time for growing other skills, which I think is important. It's healthy to do. I got music, I got work, things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things. The cons of spending all day learning a language, you're sacrificing other things of your life. And in my opinion, and for me personally, that's something I was never interested in doing.
And I think the counter argument that followers of immersion would tell you is that you could do those things in the target language as well. But then I feel like it either just takes away from the other skill you want to develop or the other hobby you want to work on, and it's just no longer fun, or there are no resources available in the target language that are as good as the ones in English. And then if we're talking about work or university or like education, that's not an option at all because you have to use your native language there, right?
Yeah. I think we're getting into the realm of those who are just obsessed with getting the language, but as you're talking about this, I feel like stressed just thinking about doing that. Like, I can imagine doing that at work. I would stop completely. So I guess what we're trying to say is one of the cons of this immersion whole phenomenon is that for some beginners, and I see it all the time, they get a little too stressed out because they're not reaching their immersion targets. We're saying it's okay. Denny speaks great Japanese. You can see his videos. And
great is a relative
Kaufman.
term.
Well, Steve Kaufman is, as you know, a great polyglot, and his Japanese is extremely good. And he never sacrificed much of his time to learn the language. He just spent bits and pieces of his day doing it.
Yeah. Another thing is, we mentioned going to work or education, right? And not really being able to avoid your native language. Another thing, which mostly applies to MIA, as far as I know, is the whole thing about not speaking the target language in the first few years, which to me just seems so absurd. I discussed this with Matt from Matt versus Japan. In one of my videos, that I believe that you have to practice speaking as well, because otherwise if you just wait and then try it in the future, you're just, you're not going to be able to do it right away. You can know a lot of the language, but if you haven't practiced speaking, it's not just going to happen by itself. But his point was that if you do keep practicing early on, then you will end up developing bad habits, right? And if you start later, then you will be able to immediately fix those little mistakes you make because your ear is more trained to hearing the language, right? But that has not really been the case for me. Yes, I have developed bad habits in Japanese, in English. I've tried a little bit of German too, but I'm mostly going to talk about Japanese and English. But eventually, because you do hear the bad habits too, because you can compare your speech to the speech of a native speaker, you can still work on them over time. And yeah, maybe it'll be a little longer that you'll have to fix the little habit you picked up. You can still do it. It's not impossible. It's not like a lost opportunity. Like, oh, why was I speaking Japanese all of that time? Now my Japanese is all broken. It doesn't work like that. You can retrain your brain. So I do not really see that as a valid point. You mentioned before that you really like to speak early on and practice early on. And I'm very much the same way.
Yeah, exactly. My whole thing is among my goals and whatnot, I want to speak to people. I mean, I lived in Japan. I have a lot of Japanese friends, and some of them don't speak English. So when I started learning Japanese, the whole goal was to speak to those people. So looking over the points you mentioned, okay, so Matt made the point that you're going to build bad habits, and sure, you'll start off speaking bad in the early stages of your language learning journey, which is completely normal. But I agree with you, Denny. You're going to be able to correct those habits if you just keep working at them and learning the language. You're going to pick up things that you didn't pick up before, and you're going to realize that's the way it's supposed to be. And you're going to correct yourself. You're going to learn, and you're going to get better. You might not even know you're getting better. It's a subconscious process. And I mean, a good example is watching your first video where you speak Japanese after 2 months. And then, compare that to your 2-year anniversary of learning the language. It is night and day. And
well, I have a 4-year video from this year.
There you go. You have a 4-year video. And if you compare the two, you're going to see a massive difference. And learning the language and speaking it at the early stages did not have any effect on your speaking ability, right? I mean, I can go into this deeper, but I'm not too sure exactly what you and Matt were discussing. But when he says you're making bad habits, I'm sure he meant things like, because I know he's into pitch accent, so you might say the things with a different accent that could be considered incorrect. You might say things out of context or different, using the wrong grammar. But as I said, things like that, they give you character. I think they actually help you. And someone out there who you meet in Japan will ask you, hey, where you're from? You got an interesting accent. I think they're all benefits.
Well, they'll ask you because of the way you look, first and foremost.
Exactly. If you're non-Asian, for us, for sure. But, that's what gives you character, right? You don't want to sound, in my opinion, I don't think it's good to sound like someone else exactly. You want to be you, right? So you have a unique identity. To conclude that part of the topic, I think speaking early is perfectly fine, and that's what I've been doing myself.
I think so too. My first time talking to a Japanese person was like chatting 3 weeks into learning Japanese when I just knew hiragana and I didn't even know the small characters of hiragana.
I bet that was one of the best things you did, right? Because it was just really cool to do. Like for me, when I spoke the first time, when I started learning Japanese seriously and I started speaking to my friends and getting better, their reaction was like, wow, Eric, you're actually learning. And it's like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this. I mean, you need to be motivated to learn the language, and speaking to people is my biggest goal, and it motivates me the most, so I'm going to have to do that. I need to do that to keep getting better at the language, and I think, Denny, that's where me and you are kind of, how do you say, onaji kachikan, which is like we kind of think alike in Japanese. So that's, exactly. So I agree with you 100%.
So getting back to the point about, not developing the bad habits with speaking, putting in all of this time, immersing, right? You have to ask, like, why would you go through so much, right? And what I feel is that the followers of these methods, they probably think that it is possible to reach a native level in their target language. And I honestly think that that is either a complete myth, that it is impossible, or it is just so extremely unlikely that you will sound like a native that you might as well not really aim for it. Because as good as you are, people who are natives will still hear the minute imperfections because you did not learn the language as a child.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if you want to try and sound like a native, go for it. That's a good goal to have. I talked earlier about opportunity cost. You really want to sound like a native, in my opinion. Be prepared to start using your target language more than your native language. That's how I see it. I feel if I wanted to start really considering being a native speaker and sound completely native in Japanese, I would need to be using more Japanese than I do English. I mean, that's just how I think of it, and that is kind of scary to me. Like, that's something I can't do.
That is part of the immersion method, right? But what I think is that even if you do that, you're still not going to get there. Natives will still hear that you're a foreigner.
That's a good point. That's true. And going a little bit more broader in that scope, what is a native speaker? You know, I've talked about this before. Everyone who's Japanese or everyone who's American, you're from Seattle, okay, in America, and you meet someone who is from Virginia or Kentucky. They are American, they're native speakers, but they speak completely differently. Their accent is different. They use words that are different. They can understand each other. Certainly they can understand each other. But what is native? Like, which one do you want to sound like?
Yeah.
If you sound like the person from Kentucky, the people from Seattle might still think, you know, you might sound a bit different. Same goes for Japanese. If you're studying a different aspect of Japanese compared to another part of Japan, you might sound like a Japanese person might think you know, you might say things differently, and that's totally fine. I mean, people from Tokyo talk differently than people from Osaka, right? So what is native? Native is anything, it can mean the vast majority of different speakers from different parts of the country. And when you say, I want to sound native, that is trying to, I think, be too specific, when native speakers in general are a very broad very broad type of people. And I just think that's another thing. It's, you know, it's just too much going on right there. And
Yeah.
I think in that sense, defining what is native should be the first. If you really want to sound like a native speaker, you should define what a native speaker sounds like. Because what let's take Matt for example, his goal, I believe, is to try and sound like a native speaker. Well, if he were to talk to someone who speaks a different style of Japanese, maybe from Okinawa, you know, to them, he might never sound native. If that makes sense, that's just kind of what my opinion is. What is native? Is native this? Is native that? So it's kind of hard to define, and therefore, when that's hard to define, I think it's a goal that's very hard to achieve. And I also think, as you said, it's near impossible to achieve.
I think that, like,
Yeah.
you could reach a native-like level, close to a native.
For sure.
I would
Yeah.
consider myself to be maybe a native-like speaker of English, because
Yeah.
I even have, like,
Totally.
people from, like, the UK, for example, who speak a kind of a different dialect of English, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of them think I'm from America, but that's most likely because they're just not as exposed to American English, right? So they think, oh yeah, this sounds close enough. They must be from America. But to a
But to
native,
some native speakers,
to an
yeah.
actual American, they will actually hear that I'm not a native speaker. And I actually had that kind of embarrassing moment with Matt when I thought he might have thought that I was a native speaker, but he said that he could tell.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of, I agree. I mean, your English is near perfect, though. It would be hard for me to distinguish you from a native speaker. Some people won't be able to tell. Some people will. So
Yeah.
Matt was able to, right?
Yeah.
For me, there's parts of it I can kind of think, okay, he's maybe from some other European maybe country, slightly different accent. But in my case, I would have to really think about it. If you didn't tell me and I just heard you in a podcast, yeah, maybe I think you're native. But, you know, as I said, how good is good? I think you're good enough. You're good enough, right? So
I actually used to really believe that it was possible. And I've met a person who went to the US to live there and study when they were 15, and they came back to Russia at 27. To me, their English sounded perfect. I'm not a native speaker, but still, to me, it sounded perfect. I thought they sounded really like an American. But this girl told me that people in the US could tell that she was a foreigner. And at the time, I could not believe it. I thought, like, no, I'll still be able to reach a native level, but I don't think it's possible. And I think that even if it is possible, for the average person, like in the practical sense, it is impossible.
Exactly.
It's like the lottery. It is possible to win the lottery, but you might as well say it's impossible to win the lottery.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good point. For most people, it's something that they'll probably won't be able to do. And it's not because, I mean, like I said before, what is native? You just choose whoever you want to sound like, and go for that. And don't worry what anyone else thinks. That's what it comes down to, and that's what I think should be the goal. And don't stress that you don't sound native. All my every Japanese friend I have, every single one of them who speaks fluently in English does not sound like a native English person, and that does not stop them from working in Canada, living in America, etc., etc.
So,
and vice versa. Yeah, Japanese English speakers living in Japan.
Yeah, we've said all of this negative stuff, but we don't actually think the immersion method is a bad method, really. What we're just saying is that it is really not for the majority of people out there. And it is a huge time investment, and it is maybe a bit of a stressful method to use, but it does give results. You can look at all sorts of MIA progress videos, and I'm sure a lot of them are pretty impressive, and they show pretty impressive results, as in like the ones where you hear the person speak after, let's say, a year or 2 years. So we're not saying it's a bad method. We're just saying it's not for everyone. And a thing I wanted to talk about was what I like to call the language learning arms race, is that in the language learning community, there is really this kind of thing about everyone having their own method, and the language learning gurus, right? They believe that their method is the best method and everyone should follow it. But I don't think that really works for everyone. You need to find the method that's suitable for you and for your lifestyle and everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's going back to when I was learning Spanish in school. The teacher taught us the way she wanted us to learn, and that is why I don't speak Spanish at all. And that's why language courses and classes have the highest fail rate, I think, in North America. No one method fits all, as you said.
Yeah.
And there are people out there that present their own methods. And you know what? If you don't like that method, this is for beginners too. If you don't like a certain method, don't worry. Just find something that fits your routine, your schedule. I always say that, when people ask, how do I start learning Japanese, or how do I structure it? What hours should I meet? Like all these very, very specific stats. And I'm just thinking, you know what? Just do hiragana, katakana, and then you're on your way. And then from there, just go on your way.
Yeah. It's like, as long as you don't do like obviously bad things, and as long as you do the basic important stuff, which is familiarizing yourself with just like at least the basic grammar, learning vocab, learning kanji, if we're talking about Japanese, right? And then most importantly, doing a lot of listening, doing a lot of reading, and I believe you should do a lot of speaking too, whenever you can. If you just do the basic, most important things, and you do them consistently, then you shouldn't worry that much about your specific method.
Oh, totally. I agree. Everyone's different, right? And everyone needs to find their own way. And that would probably work, something would work better for you than it would for me, but that's totally fine. We're still gonna achieve our goals, whatever they are. You don't want to feel pressure, I guess. Like in school, you get tests a lot, you gotta memorize this, you have to use these, you gotta use these specific books, and that's not fun. I mean, that's not something most students want to do, right? So,
yeah.
Language learning, I guess, moving into the next topic would be language learning should be fun, which is what I think is the most important thing for language learners.
Yeah, like the main point that I want the viewers to take away from this video is that if you're learning a language, you should really be having fun learning the language. And if you're stressing too much about how many hours you're putting in, how you're studying the language, if you're meeting your quota, right, you're not really doing it right. You should really have fun, because it's going to be more sustainable for you and more enjoyable. Does it really matter if you became whatever your definition of fluent is in 3 years versus, 7 years? Does it really matter? I don't really think so, because as long as you're having fun, what matters is just the end goal.
Exactly. Yep. And everyone's goal is different.
Yeah.
Have fun. Enjoy the process, and don't stress too much. It's takes time. That's the one thing you just got to get over. And as I said earlier, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable with the language.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly go back to the language learning arms race method, the methods and everything that you mentioned about how these different groups emerge. We've got AJAT, we've got MIA, we've got Steve Kaufman's approach. We got maybe Danny, you have your own approach. But you know what? We talk about the pros, and there is a pro to all of this. Because every language learner is different. We need these groups. We need AJAT. We need AJAT for the hardcore Japanese learners who want to find a way to learn as fast as possible, and they have as much time as possible. We need Steve Kaufmans who are full-time workers who are busy with other things, but they're able to get to a level of fluency using their way. We need Matt who's maybe in between that. So all these different methods appeal to different people, and that's what's awesome about the Japanese language learning community. Those 3 methods that I mentioned earlier, I guarantee you they've influenced more people to learn Japanese than any school, any Dragon Ball Z film. I mean, of course, there's a lot of pop culture from Japan in America, but up until recently, I've just seen a surge in learning Japanese, and people think, and it's because of people like Katsumoto, Matt, Steve Kaufman. So yeah, I mean, those are just great. I think these little communities we build are great. The negative aspect is, when you feel pressure to do one exactly the way the rules are set out to be. You know what? Just grab bits and pieces. I use mass immersion approach. I use some of that. I use some of AJAT. I do some of what Steve mentions, and it works for me. So, yeah, just have fun, and it's great to see. I think these communities build because it just helps beginners from all different aspects and different backgrounds.
Well, yeah, I guess that about does it. Is there anything else you would like to say in closing?
I think that was pretty much all I wanted to say. It'd be great to do another video together, maybe in a year or so or whenever. I'm sure one day we'll be able to do a full-blown video in Japanese. I know you're a bit more ahead than I am, even though the irony is I lived in Japan for a few years. And that's something I guess I should mention is people ask me, hey Eric, why did you not learn Japanese when you lived in Japan? I lived there for almost 3 years, and I worked various jobs. I taught English, and then I moved into a startup and did marketing for North America. Came back to Canada, then I started learning Japanese. I got involved with Link and Steve Kaufman. That really kicked my language learning motivation up a notch. And I look back to my time in Japan. The reason I did not learn any Japanese was not because I couldn't, I gave up. It was because I wasn't motivated to. And motivation, I think, is the biggest factor for language learners. And when I came back, I started getting motivated, and I've been wanting to return to Japan one day and talk to my friends. That's my motivation. And so, yeah, that's how I started learning Japanese and why I continue to do. That's all I wanted to say. Just motivation is the key.
Yeah. So I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Eric, for participating in this discussion with me. And thank you, everyone, for watching this video. I hope that you could take away something useful for yourself. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Wait, just one last thing. I just wanted to announce that I finally decided to open a Patreon account. So if you would like to support me and you have the spare money, then you can do so now. My main goal is basically to just kind of go deeper into YouTube and make more content for you guys, and yeah, try to focus a bit more on this. If you would like to support my channel, you can feel free to do so. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.